Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam and Hilchos Ishus, Perek Chav Gimel, Halacha Yud Gimel. Let me just read the halacha, and then we'll go into understanding the principles behind it and the different opinions about this. Ish v'isha, shehayu b'neim shidduchim. A man and a woman are talking about getting married. They're thinking about getting engaged. V'amallah, and the man says to her, Kama at machneses li. How much material things are you bringing into the marriage? Kach v'kach, so much and so much. And then v'amrolei, then she says back to him, V'kama at haneisen li, a case of li. How much are you going to give me, or how much are you writing to pledge to give me? Kach v'kach, so much and so much. And then he goes on, the same thing would happen if it's a father who's marrying off, who's doing things on behalf of a son or daughter. So what happens? Amdu v'kitshu, if they get married, konu eisim hadvarim, all of those things that they promise to give one another, they are acquired. In other words, it's a legal transaction. Kinyan, even though there was no Kinyan. A Kinyan is an act that was instituted as a formal way of transmitting anything of value to another person. In other words, if I just say to you, my house is yours, the house doesn't become yours. You have to do some formal act, whether it's a house, whether it's real estate, whether it's a car, whether it's any object, you need a kinyan. But here, this is an exception to the rule, and the Rambam concludes, which is taken from the Gemara, ve'elu hein hadvarim haniknim ba'amira. These are the things that can be acquired with mere speech, with merely verbal. It doesn't require any action. This is the Rambam's view, which is not contested. It's based on the Gemara in Kedushin and Iksubas, and there's no dispute about this. However, the Haggas Maimonus, on the Rambam over here, quotes the Baal HaItur, one of the early Rishonim, who writes that even if it's something that is not yet in existence, that means they're talking about giving someone something that doesn't yet exist. And normally, there's a law that you cannot sell something, give something, acquire something that has not yet come into this world. But over here, the Haggas Maimonides brings from the Itur, Baal HaItur, and the names of the Ge'onim, that even though it doesn't exist here, it is acquired. When it's purchased later on, it's transferred from the possession of one to the other as they promised. That's the opinion of the Baal HaItur in the name of the Ge'onim. However, the Rambam himself, although he doesn't talk about it here, but he does talk about this in Hilchos Chiyah Umatana, where he repeats the halacha over here about marriage. He says, this is in Perek Vav Halacha Yud Zayin, Kvar biyarnu b'nisuyim, we already explained when it comes to marriage, Sheshnayim shehayu b'neim shidduchim, two people who are talking about marriage with one another, getting engaged. And what happens, and one says to the other, how much are you giving me? How, so much and so much, and so on and so forth. Fourth, they acquire these things with mere speech, just with using words. Then Rambam adds, Ve'enan kainin ba'amiru zu ad shasan esuyin, that they don't acquire anything actually until they actually get married. But then he adds the caveat, V'tzrichen sheyu hadvarim shepasku mitsuyin b'rushusa. Whatever they're deciding to give the other, they have to give something that's already in their possession. Why? A person cannot sell something, give something, and acquire something that has not yet come into this world, as was explained in earlier halachas. So we have a clear dispute between the Rambam and the Baal HaItur. The Baal HaItur says you could sell something, in this case, even though it doesn't yet exist. This is an exception to the general rule. And the Rambam says, no, there's no difference between this and all the other halachas where you cannot sell something if it doesn't yet exist. So what is the crux of the dispute between them? There are two possible ways of explaining it. One possible way of explaining it is based on the question as to why it is that one cannot sell something that doesn't yet exist. Why not? So there seems to be two opinions, and it goes back to the Rishonim, and some Svarim say that it could even be found rooted in different opinions in the Gemara. The Mukhi Yosef in Bava Metzia, he's the one who says this explicitly, as do other Rishonim and Achreinim, that it's a matter of Gemiras Das. What does Gemiras Das mean? When a person sells something, you could say, I'm selling you something, I'm giving you something, but do you really mean it? How do we know that your resolve is there? How do we know that you actually mean it and you're not just throwing things out for the sake of throwing things out and you're not really sincere? To prove Gemiras Das, that this is your true intention, you perform an act, a Kinyan. That's generally the idea of a Kinyan. How do we know you really mean it? You performed an act. You gave the money for it, you wrote a contract, you did something, you pulled it, you picked it up, and all different forms of Kinyanim. But there are other Rishonim, and it's clearly mentioned by the Levush, and also earlier by the Tashbetz, one of the late Rishonim, that it's based on the idea that a Kinyan has to be chal on something. It has to devolve on something. There's nothing there. It's air. The thing doesn't exist yet. How could you have a Kinyan on something that doesn't yet exist? That's the way it's generally understood, that there are two different approaches. Now let's take these two approaches and apply it to our situation over here. If we take the approach that the reason why we can't sell something because there's a lack of Gemiras Das, there's a lack of resolve when something doesn't yet exist. Let's look at this situation. Why is it that in this case you don't need a Kinyan? This is an exception to the general rule. Why is that? So the Rambam himself explains that it's based on the fact that because they want to get married and because they are going to benefit from being married to one another, they really want to transfer the property to the other. There's a certain benefit. This is not a usual case of me selling something when it's not sure if I really mean it a sincere. Here, there's a certain mutual pleasure and benefit. Therefore, they certainly resolve to sell it, to give it, to transfer it. So over here, the reason why you don't need a Kinyan is because there is Gemiras Das. That's why it's an exception to the rule. Because there's Gemiras Das, then what's the difference between whether something is in the world yet now or is not in the world? So that explains the opinion of the Baal HaItur, not Rambam, the Baal HaItur, that says it doesn't make a difference, even if it doesn't yet exist. The whole reason why, if it doesn't exist, the Kinyan is not valid is because there's a chasar and a lack of Gemiras Das. But here we don't care. We do know there's Gemiras Das. So the fact that it's not yet in existence doesn't detract from the fact that there's Gemiras Das. That would be the opinion of the Baal HaItur. The Rambam would go in the opinion of the other Rishonim or Achreinim who say that it's based on the idea that you can't make a Kinyan if something doesn't yet exist. And therefore, the Rambam maintains that you can't sell something, you can't transfer something, even though there's Gemiras Das. That's very nice, there's Gemiras Das. But that's why the Kinyan over here is valid. But the reason why you can't transfer something that isn't yet in existence, it's irrespective of the Gemiras Das. You can have all the Gemiras Das in the world. It needs a tangible thing upon which to devolve. And therefore, Rambam says, here's no exception to the general rule. It's interesting, the Rivash, one of the Rishonim, agrees with the Rambam on this matter, and the Rivash seems to suggest that the reason why you can't transfer something that doesn't yet exist in the world is based on the fact that it doesn't have anything upon which to devolve. Let me just quote a Rivash, very interesting Rivash. Someone says to the Rivash that he heard that the Tur, Rabbi Yaakov, said in the name of his father, the Rush, that someone wants to sell something that doesn't yet exist. You know it's not good. You can't do that. But he swears to the person that he's going to sell it to him. So he says that the Rush says that the Kinyan is valid. Why? He doesn't say why, but he brings a proof. The proof is Yaakov purchased the birthright from Esav. Birthright didn't yet exist. But Esav made a shvuah. He swore to it. So you see from here that even something that doesn't exist, swearing is good enough. That's what this person wrote to the Rivash. And the Rivash answered very sharply as follows. Loi harazal v'loi harav Rabbeinu Yaakov chasimi Allah. The Rosh, neither the Rosh and neither Rabbi Yaakov, the Tur, put his seal, his imprimatur on this statement. And I would never attribute such a statement to such great people. There's nothing, it has no basis. And the proof is essentially null and void. Because this happened before the Torah was given. So who says that in those days you couldn't sell something that didn't yet exist? Maybe in those days the law was different. And so then if it works without a shavua, why did he swear? The swearing was just an extra boost, not because you needed the shavua, but we wanted to make sure, Yaakov wanted to make sure that Esav wouldn't dissemble, that he wouldn't go back on his word. That's why he made him swear. But the truth is, you don't need a shvuah before Matan Torah. You could sell something that doesn't yet exist. Once the Torah was given, that all changed. Now, if we say that the reason you can't sell something is because there's no gemiras das, you can't sell something that doesn't yet exist because there's no gemiras das, so what's the difference between before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah? And you could derive one from the other. The Rebbe explains in a Sikha that the klal, the principle that you can't derive things from before Matan Torah, it's only if you're talking about a halacha. If you're talking about a svara, a logical thing based on human nature, based on just on logic, then it doesn't make a difference if it's before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah. The Rebbe gives the example of the law that you have to have 7 days of partying, Ships Yemei Mishta, after a wedding. We derive that from the Torah where it talks about Lavan. Why? And that you can't have one simcha within another. Yaakov had to wait another week before marrying Rachel because ein ma'arvim simcha b'simcha. You can't conflate one simcha with another one. How can we learn from that story? That's before Matan Torah. So the Rebbe says that's a svara. That's based on logic. Does one simcha take away from another? And the answer is yes. If you're focusing on one person, you can't celebrate another person. It diminishes the simcha of the first. So here also, if we say the reason you can't sell something that doesn't yet exist is because there's a chasara and a lack of gemiras das, that was true before Matan Torah. So the same law then would apply today. So from this we see that the Rivash maintained that it has nothing to do with gemiras das. It's because there's nothing upon which the Kinyan should be chal. Maybe that's a halacha, that you need something upon which to be chal, and that halacha didn't exist before Matan Torah. Now it's interesting that though the Rivash says it couldn't possibly be that the Tur and the Rosh put their name on this type of a halacha, in fact, you look in the Tur's commentary on the Torah, he does quote his father, the Rosh, and he did in fact say this. So we have to say that they hold that it is gemiras das, like the Mukhi Yosef, and like the Baal Ha'iter, as we just explained. They hold it is gemiras das, that gemiras das is what makes the Kinyan, and therefore, if it's something that doesn't yet exist, there's a lack of gemiras das, and that's why Yaakov needed a shvuah, because the shvuah changes that. That certifies that this is real, that there's real gemiras das. This whole idea that sometimes gemiras das could exist even without a Kinyan, we find this in other places. I'll give you just two examples. One example is the Rebbe in a Hadran on the Yerushalmi of Shvius talks about Rav, that Rav, when he would say, I'm giving a gift, he would never go back on his word. And from the Gemara there, the Rebbe proves, it seems that it was a real Kinyan. Why is there a Kinyan? It's Midas Chassidus. It's not required. If you say, I'm going to give you a gift, you don't have to give the gift. Rav, personally, was someone who kept his word, but it doesn't transfer the object to the other person. So the Rebbe explains, because Rav would never go back on his word, we know for sure that this is something that he would really want to give. And therefore, there's an actual Kinyan. So you see that sometimes when you know that there's a gemiras das, because of an external reason, like Rav was never a person who would ever go back on his word, that takes the place of the Kinyan. Another example, the Rambam says that hefker, when you make something hefker, he says, is like a neder. When you make something hefker, you're making a vow that this should be hefker. So what does that mean? So the Ktsas explains, and it's a very difficult Ktsas, in Siman Reishai and Gimel, that the Rambam is saying that when you make something hefker, there's no kinyan. It's just that you have a neder, you have a vow, you have to keep it. That's what makes the thing property for everyone who wants to take it. Not because there was an actual kinyan, but because you have a law that says that you make a neder, you can't go back on your word. The Chidushei Harim says another explanation. He says, because you made a neder and you can't go back on your word, that makes the kinyan. That means the Gemiras Das sometimes can make the Kinyan when you know the Gemiras Das is there, either because of a Shavu in the case of Esav and Yaakov, or because of the story over here by the man and the woman who make an agreement because of the benefit that each one gets from the other. They're willing to give something and mere speech is enough. Or in the case of Hefker, where you make a neder, that makes the Kinyan valid. There's another way of explaining the dispute between the Baal HaItur and the Rambam, whether you could give something, promise something that doesn't yet exist, and if the Kinyan is valid. It's based on a dispute between the Noda B'Yehuda and his son-in-law. His name was Rabbi Yosef. It seems he was a very great person. And they go back and forth in several places in the Medura Kama and Medura Tinyana. What is their argument about? It's about this Rambam, which is essentially a Gemara. What is the reason for this Kinyan? Rabbi Yosef, the son-in-law of the Noda B'Yehuda, says it's based strictly on the idea of Gemiras Das, that you see that this person really means it, so the mere verbal declaration that I'm giving you this, that makes the Kinyan. It's based strictly on Gemiras Das. The Noda B'Yehuda says no, it's not based on Gemiras Das. It's a takana of the Chachamim. The Chachamim, the sages, enacted that here you can make a Kinyan with but speech. Why did they make this transaction? Because generally speaking, people have Gemiras Das. So even if you don't have the Gemiras Das, nevertheless, this Kinyan is a valid Kinyan. So that could be the dispute between the Rambam, the Baal HaItur. If you say the thing is based on Gemiras Das, then it's possible to even do something that doesn't yet exist, because you know there's Gemiras Das. The person really wants to give that as a gift to the other partner. But the Rambam holds like the Noda B'Yehuda, that it's based on a takanas Chachamim. The Chachamim said, because there's Gemiras Das, we're going to make a takana that just speech alone is enough. But if speech alone is enough, because Chachamim made speech like a Kinyan, it can't be stronger than any other Kinyan. So even if there's Gemiras Das, so what? But no Kinyan, with all due respect to the svara of Gemiras Das, no Kinyan could be on something that doesn't yet exist. And this is a Kinyan that the Chachamim instituted to be like any other Kinyan, so it has to have the limits of any other Kinyan. And that explains why the Rambam holds you cannot do this to something that doesn't yet exist, because the Kinyan does not exist when something is not yet in this world.